The air that morning was thick with the scent of rain. Clouds hung low over the suburban neighborhood of Maplewood, where the sound of sprinklers, barking dogs, and the distant rumble of traffic usually painted a calm backdrop for ordinary days. But that day was anything but ordinary. David Turner, a widowed father in his late 40s, had always been the strong pillar of his small family. His son, Ethan Turner, 17 and eager to step into adulthood, often looked to his father for guidance. They had learned to lean on each other since the passing of Emily, David's wife and Ethan's mother, 3 years earlier. The bond between father and son had only deepened through their grief. David had become both protector and confidant, and Ethan had grown from a quiet boy into a responsible young man with his father's steady influence. That morning, David woke early, pouring himself a cup of coffee while glancing out the kitchen window. The sky looked unsettled, but he brushed it off. Ethan stumbled down the stairs a few minutes later, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He had his driving test scheduled that day, and David had promised to let him take the car to practice. "Big day," David said, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs toward him. "Yeah," Ethan replied with a nervous grin. "I've been practicing parallel parking in my head all night." David chuckled. "That's the spirit. Just remember, slow, steady, and calm. You'll do fine." Neither of them could have predicted how those same words, "stay calm," would later take on a meaning far beyond driving. The morning passed like any other. After breakfast, they decided to head out for a quick practice run before Ethan's test. David tossed him the keys to the family sedan, and they set off down the tree-lined streets. Ethan drove cautiously, checking mirrors and signals, while David offered pointers from the passenger seat. They both laughed when Ethan made a too-wide turn and accidentally startled a squirrel darting across the road. By late morning, they parked near a small café to grab coffee before heading to the DMV. The café was bustling, the smell of roasted beans and pastries filling the air. Ethan excused himself to the restroom while David waited at a corner table, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. It happened suddenly. The door of the café swung open, and a man stumbled inside. His clothes were disheveled, his face pale, and in his shaking hands was something that made everyone freeze. A gun. Gasps filled the café. Chairs scraped against the floor as people ducked behind tables. The barista let out a cry and dropped the pot of coffee she was holding. David's eyes snapped to Ethan, who had just stepped out of the restroom, frozen in shock at the sight. The man's voice cracked as he shouted, "Nobody move." He looked desperate, his eyes darting wildly. "I just need money. Empty the register." Ethan's breath hitched, and David saw the panic rising in his son's face. He knew Ethan's first instinct might be to run, or worse, to say something, but one wrong move could set off the trembling stranger. Without thinking, David locked eyes with his son and whispered firmly, "Stay calm, son." The words cut through the chaos like a lifeline. Ethan's chest heaved, but he nodded, clutching the strap of his backpack tightly. He remembered his father's tone, steady and grounding, as if David had rehearsed for this very moment. The gunman waved the weapon nervously toward the counter. The barista fumbled with the cash drawer, tears streaking her face. David kept his hands visible on the table, watching every twitch of the man's movements. He wasn't trained for situations like this, but his instincts as a father sharpened his focus. His only mission was to keep Ethan safe. Time seemed to slow. The cafe patrons crouched in silence, every breath shallow. David whispered again, softer this time, but just as clear, "Stay calm." It was as much for himself as it was for his son. The man stuffed cash into his pockets, but his hand shook so violently that bills fluttered to the floor. He swore under his breath, his eyes scanning the cafe like a cornered animal. That's when Ethan made a mistake. He shifted slightly, and the movement caught the gunman's attention. "You!" the man barked, pointing the gun directly at Ethan. "What are you doing?" Ethan froze, his face pale. David's heart lurched, but he raised his hands higher and spoke quickly, his voice steady. "He's just a kid. He's not doing anything. Please don't point that at him." The man's breathing was ragged. His finger twitched dangerously near the trigger. David's mind raced. He could see Ethan's shoulders trembling, the way his son's knuckles turned white as he clutched his backpack. David whispered again, almost a command, "Ethan, stay calm." Something about those words seemed to anchor Ethan. He straightened slightly, meeting his father's gaze, and willed himself not to make another sudden move. The man's eyes darted between father and son. He muttered something incoherent, then stumbled backward toward the door, his pockets stuffed with money. He seemed torn between running and lashing out. David seized the moment. "You don't want to do this," he said carefully, his voice calm but firm. "Take what you need and go. Nobody's going to stop you." For a tense second, the man's hand trembled, the gun still aimed. Then, with a strangled curse, he shoved the door open and bolted into the rainy street. The door banged shut behind him, leaving the cafe in stunned silence. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the barista collapsed behind the counter, sobbing. Someone whispered, "Call 911." Chairs creaked as patrons slowly rose from their crouched positions. Ethan, however, remained frozen, his chest rising and falling rapidly. David rushed to his side, gripping his shoulders firmly. "It's over. You're okay. You did good, son. You stayed calm." But inside, David's own hands were shaking. He had never felt such raw fear, not even during the darkest days of his wife's illness. Watching a gun aimed at his boy, knowing how fragile that moment was, had cut him to the core. The police arrived minutes later, taking statements and securing the scene. The robber was caught 2 blocks away, drenched in rain, the stolen money spilling from his jacket. The officers commended the cafe patrons for staying calm, but for David, the praise meant little. All that mattered was that Ethan was safe. That night, back at home, Ethan sat quietly on the couch. The television played in the background, but neither of them paid attention. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Dad, when he pointed the gun at me, I thought that was it." His voice cracked, and his hands trembled slightly. "But then I heard you say to stay calm. I don't know how, but it worked. I just focused on your voice." David pulled him into a hug, something he hadn't done since Ethan was much younger. "I meant every word, son. No matter what happens, you keep calm, you keep steady. That's how we make it through." Ethan buried his face in his father's shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, he let the tears fall. The next day, news stations covered the incident. "Armed robbery at Maplewood Cafe ends without injury," the headline read. But what the reporters didn't capture was the quiet strength between a father and son that had turned fear into survival. For Ethan, that day became a defining moment.